I'm curious to further unpack the glutes in bridge pose. I appreciate the debunked myth slash cue of relaxing the glutes. Obviously, this doesn't make sense because the glutes have to work. However, I was taught to cue something like allow the glutes to work, but also focus on the front abdominals to lift the hips into bridge. I'm trying to make sense of this cue biomechanically, which maybe makes sense because the abs are working against gravity, similarly to the hip abductors lifting the floating leg in half moon. Jenny, can you please chime in with your perspective on whether this is a helpful cue in this shape? Okay, so she understands that in bridge pose, it is a myth that we should cue to relax the glutes in bridge pose. I'm sure we're all on the same page about this. The glutes in bridge, the glutes are like our biggest and our main hip extensor muscle. They do hip extension. So we don't want to cue to relax them. It doesn't make biomechanical sense. They have to be working. They work along with some other muscles, but they're like our biggest hip extensor muscle. So we don't want to cue to relax. But what Carly is saying is that she had been taught to cue something like allow the glutes to work, but also focus on the front abdominals to lift the hips into bridge. I'm trying to make sense of this cue biomechanically. And maybe it makes sense because the abs are working against gravity, similarly to the hip abductors lifting the floating leg in half moon. Okay, so let's look at that for a second. It is true that in half moon, the hip abductors, that's the lateral hip muscles, in half moon pose, these lateral hip muscles, they work to lift the leg against gravity. If these muscles were not working, the leg would be like this. Gravity would move the leg like that. So these work to lift the leg, yes. But in half moon, one thing to consider is that the foot is free to move. So the hip abductors, they like lift the foot, the whole leg straight up. So that is correct. When it comes to bridge pose, bridge pose is hip extension. But Carly's asking about the abdominals and saying that she was taught that we should cue, allow the glutes to work, but also use the front abdominals to lift the hips up. So the abdominals, what they do, they run from the pelvis up to the rib cage and they flex the spine. That's what they do. They do spinal flexion. So this is what would happen if we worked the abdominals. But this joint action is not what's happening in bridge pose. Bridge pose, the spine is on the floor and then we lift the hips up. And then of course that will take with it like generally the lumbar spine up. So abdominals do this. They would curl us up away from the floor. The hip extensors do this. So bridge pose is not really an abdominal pose. It's not, if we were in a reclined position and we wanted to work the abdominals, then it would be something more like a pose we also covered, Ardha Navasana, something like this. Then the abdominals, they would curl us up and then maybe we would curl the pelvis. But this type of movement would be abdominals. Bridge pose is much more like the back body lifting us up. So there's that. It's so the abdominals, I know Carly is saying that they're working against gravity like the hip abductors in half moon, but it's not the same. The hip abductors in half moon, yes, they lift the leg up because if they weren't, the gravity would take the leg down. But that's not what's happening in bridge pose. They are, the belly is facing up, but that doesn't mean that the abdominals are working against gravity because they're not in bridge pose. And because feet are down and it's the back body is like powering us up. It's not the abdominals. And if the abdominals were working, they would be curling the spine into flexion. They don't do hip extension. So we want to kind of separate that out. Bridge pose is mainly a hip extension pose. We cue the movement and then the muscles that do that movement, they, as a byproduct, they will fire. Our nervous system does that automatically. It knows what needs to work in order to make the movement, to achieve the movement. We don't want to overcomplicate movement and we don't want to micromanage. And when it comes to which specific muscles fire when we do any movement, that's not something that we as yoga teachers need to try to control or cue. The muscle firing happens automatically by our nervous system, and it's the muscles that are fired to create the movement that we want to create. So, a really good teaching tip that I really like to try to embody and share with teachers who are learning with me, I would just suggest that you try this on and just see how it goes for you. But instead of thinking too much about telling students which muscles should be working, don't think about it as muscles forward. Muscles are like in the background. And what we want to cue is just the movement. Cue the movement, not the muscles. And then the right muscles that need to do the job will automatically be coordinated by the student's super sophisticated nervous system to make the movement happen. So cue the movement, not the muscle. If I want to like lift my knee up in some, say like in this position, I wouldn't want to cue, use your hip flexors or be more specific, use your psoas muscle or your iliacus muscle or, any of our specific hip flexors. I wouldn't cue, use your psoas to lift your knee up because that's overcomplicating it. There are many different muscles that can all flex the hip, and we don't need to get specific. We don't even know which one will fire. And muscles, they don't work that way anyway in like this single muscle on, single muscle off. It's movement happens on the motor unit level, which is like these tiny subsets of muscles anyway. That's how our brain connects to our muscular system to create movement. So it's all just so much more complex than trying to guide actual single muscles to do work. It's movement happens on the motor unit level, and all of that is coordinated by the nervous system. So if you want to come into like this position, we can simply say, lift your knee up. And then the right muscles, and really specifically the right motor units of individual muscles, all of that just happens automatically, and we don't need to overthink it. Lift your knee up. You might say, feel your hip flexors working. And I do the cues like that a lot in my teaching, like feel the area where you feel the work happening. And since I know the biomechanics of our poses, I know that when we lift the knee against gravity, that will be the hip flexors, but that's a whole group of muscles. So I might cue like lift the knee and then observe, like feel the front of your hip, the hip flexors working. But that's a lot different. That's more on the observation side. Like notice what's working rather than you need to make these individual muscles work. So hopefully that makes sense. Cue the movement, and the actual muscles that need to do the work will naturally fire. Cue the movement, not the muscles. I would just suggest that we try that on if that's something that we haven't tried before. And you may notice that it helps simplify your cueing, and it helps us not overcomplicate. And that's better for the student and movement experience. And then we can, use our teaching to more guide students to observe, like, what do you feel working? Where generally is the work? But just kind of more general, like the hip flexors, not necessarily a specific muscle. So when it comes to bridge pose, bringing this back to bridge, like what I talked about in the lecture video was all we need to say here is lift your hips up. And that's all we have to do. We don't need to say, allow the glutes to work or do work the glutes or don't work. Like we just don't need to say any, that's a muscle-based cue. And same thing with abdominals. We don't need to say, work your glutes and work your abdominals to lift your hips up, because now we understand the abdominals don't lift the hips up anyway. They flex the spine, but we also just don't need to cue muscles first. We just cue the movement and then the muscles fire to make that happen. So lift your hips up, and automatically the muscles that need to do that will do that, which is the glutes. So hopefully that is like a relevant teaching tip and just helps to kind of simplify the way that we might think about bridge pose. We don't need to get super specific. We can just cue the movement and let the muscles that need to do that work. Same thing, just to kind of along this theme. So Carly was saying about half moon pose and how the hip abductors lift the leg. So they absolutely do. And she's totally correct about that. And that's good for us as teachers who are wanting to understand movement. It's good for us to know the hip abductors are working here. But it's not that when we teach half moon, we would need to tell our students, work your hip abductors in order to lift the leg. Like we don't need to add the muscle in there. We can just say, it's a group of muscles, but we could just say, lift your leg up. And then automatically the hip abductors are doing that. And we could draw their attention to that work if we wanted to, if that was like made sense with our teaching focus, or we could not. But we just don't need to, we could just direct the movement, which is which is actively abducting the hip against gravity there. So hopefully that makes sense. Try on the idea of teaching the movement, not the muscles, and let things be simpler and not as complicated. We don't need to overthink it.